Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. My safe room started as a mistake. On the 5th day, after the emergency alerts stopped feeling like a drill, I tried to move above ground at dawn, thinking the streets would be quiet. I was wrong. The city sounded hollow. Sirens fading in the distance, glass popping under heat, and that constant background of human voices turned into something else. I got turned around by a barricade that wasn't there yesterday, ran into a crowd that wasn't alive enough to negotiate with, and I ended up doing the one thing you're never supposed to do in a system like this. I went underground. I'm in New York City. That matters because the subway here isn't just tracks and stations. It's layers, passenger tunnels, service corridors, electrical rooms, pump rooms, ventilation shafts, cross passages and doors behind doors that nobody notices unless they have a key or a reason. I had both. Before everything fell apart, I was a maintenance electrician contracted for transit work. Night shifts, signal power cabinets, lighting circuits, pump controls, emergency egress lighting, that kind of thing. I knew where the maintenance hatches were, I knew which doors were stuck, and I knew which sections were older than the rest of the system because the concrete looked different and the hardware had a different shape. I never thought that knowledge would keep me alive. That morning, it did. I found the hatch on a narrow service platform between stations, one of those places passengers never see, where the tile gives way to raw concrete and the air smells like wet metal. The hatch was a maintenance access plate set into the wall, a rectangle of heavy steel with bolt holes and a handle that didn't look like a handle unless you knew how to pull it. It took my whole weight, shoulder braced, feet planted on oily ballast. When it finally moved, it didn't swing open. It shifted with a dry grind, and a breath of stale air came out like the tunnel itself was exhaling. The opening was barely wide enough for a person with a backpack. I slid in sideways, scraping my arms on the frame, and pulled the plate back toward me until it clicked into place. When it sealed, the noise from the main tunnel dropped from a roar to a muffled rumble, like a storm moved farther away. For the first time in days, I was alone. Not safe, not comfortable, but alone. The service corridor was buried under an older tunnel that had been partially collapsed for years. There were old work orders about it, mostly ignored because it wasn't a passenger route anymore. The corridor was a maintenance spine, utility lines and narrow walkways running parallel to the track bed. The ceiling had cracked in several places, with concrete spalls hanging like teeth. Some sections had already come down, leaving piles of rubble and rebar that looked like exposed ribs. But it was still accessible, and I could still move through it. I didn't go far that first day. I didn't have the energy and the air felt wrong. Underground air always has a taste, but this was thicker, dusty and stale. I could hear water dripping steadily somewhere ahead, and every few minutes there was a dull thud from above as something stumbled along the tracks. The infected didn't move like people. Even when they were quiet, they weren't careful. They hit walls, they hit doors, they hit anything that resisted them. Each impact carried through the concrete. I sat with my back against the corridor wall and forced myself to breathe slowly. I kept my headlamp off. Light underground is a beacon, and I wasn't ready to advertise. In my bag, I had what I'd grabbed in panic: 2 liters of water, a half-full box of protein bars, a small first aid pouch, a compact pry bar, a folding utility knife, a roll of electrical tape, a flashlight, spare batteries, and a handheld radio that was already useless because everything I'd heard on it the last 2 days was static and distant shouting. I also had the one thing I'd never thought I'd carry in the city: a firearm, It's not a fantasy weapon. It's not something I'm proud of. It's a compact 9mm pistol I'd bought years ago after a robbery near my apartment, then barely touched. I had 2 magazines, and I'd counted the rounds like they were pieces of gold. A gun in a tunnel is loud. It's also final. If I used it, I had to accept that everything within a long radius would hear it, and in a subway system, sound travels. The pistol stayed holstered. The first real work started the next day. I didn't call it a safe room at first. I called it a corner, then a shelter, then a place to sleep that wasn't directly under the worst cracks. But once I understood what the corridor actually was, how it connected to other utility spaces, how it ran under older sections of tunnel, and how it could keep me away from the streets, I made a decision. If I was going to live underground, I needed a secure space inside it, not just somewhere to lie down. A room I could seal. A place that bought time if something got in. I chose my site based on 3 things: structure, access, and air. Structure came first. I walked to the corridor slowly, tapping the ceiling with the pry bar, listening. Hollow is bad, a sharp, brittle sound is bad, a deeper, solid thud is better. I looked at the cracks. Thin hairline cracks can exist forever. Wider cracks that show rust stains or separation are a warning. I found a section where the concrete looked older but more intact, reinforced with thick steel beams that were part of an old support retrofit. The beams were riveted, not welded, which told me the installation was from a different era. They were ugly, but they were heavy. Access came second. I needed a location that had at least 2 routes out, not 2 doors in the same line, 2 different ways to leave if one was blocked by rubble, fire, or bodies. One route was the corridor itself, back toward the maintenance hatch. The other was an old inspection doorway, an inset steel doorframe half buried behind conduit racks that led to a forgotten utility chamber. The door was jammed with mineral deposits and rust. It hadn't been opened in years. That was good. That meant nobody else was using it. It also meant if I could open it, I'd have an escape path nobody expected. Air came third, and it was the hardest. Underground, you don't die quickly unless you do something stupid. You die slowly from bad air, dehydration, infection, or exhaustion. The service corridor had small cracks in places where it intersected with ventilation shafts. I couldn't see the shafts directly, but I could feel faint drafts when I held my hand near certain seams. I marked those spots with tape on the wall, then watched how dust moved in my flashlight beam. If the dust drifted, there was airflow. If it hung still, there wasn't. I chose a corner near a faint draft, and near that jammed inspection doorway. It wasn't perfect, but nothing underground ever is. Building a room in a collapsed corridor isn't about constructing from scratch. It's about shaping what's already there, reinforcing it, and controlling entry points. My first job was clearing debris. I did it by hand, piece by piece, because heavy impacts could trigger a secondary collapse. I used the pry bar to lever chunks of concrete away, then carried them to a rubble pile farther down the corridor. Every piece made noise. I timed my work between the thuds above, trying to blend my sound into theirs. I found old rail hardware embedded in the debris, sections of steel rail, tie plates, spikes, and lengths of angle iron that had been stored down there decades ago. Those became my raw materials. Rail steel is not easy to cut with hand tools, but you don't always need to cut it. You can brace with it, you can wedge it, you can use it as a post if you can get one end seated against solid concrete. For support beams, I used what the corridor gave me. 2 lengths of angle iron and 1 heavy tie plate became a crude frame. I anchored the frame by drilling small pilot holes into softer mortar joints with a hand drill I scavenged later, then driving in bolts I found in an abandoned supply crate. Nothing about it was pretty, but the point wasn't aesthetics. The point was to reduce the chance that a small collapse at the wrong time would pin me in my sleep. Then I started the real transformation, carving the safe room. I scavenged steel plates from abandoned train cars over the next week. That part was dangerous, because it meant going into sections of track that were closer to active infected movement. But the abandoned cars were there. Dark hulks in side tunnels and storage tracks, some with doors half open, some with shattered windows. I avoided the passenger areas. I went for the undercarriage panels, the heavier interior steel sections, anything that could serve as armor. I didn't have power tools at first. I had a wrench, a screwdriver, and stubbornness. I learned quickly that many panels were held by bolts that could be loosened if they weren't rusted solid. For the ones that were, I used leverage, pry bar under the edge, slow pressure, and a lot of patience. When something finally gave, it sounded like a gunshot in the quiet, and I'd freeze, headlamp off, listening for movement. The first time I heard infected respond to that noise, I understood how close they were. The sound came from above and it moved along the track line like a wave, shuffling, scraping, a few impacts against concrete. Then silence again. I dragged the plates back through the corridor one at a time. They were heavy enough to make my shoulders ache for days. I laid them against my chosen corner and started building a shell. One plate for a back wall, one for a side, one for a partial front barrier. I left only a narrow entry gap, just wide enough for me to squeeze through sideways. The idea wasn't to make it impenetrable. The idea was to create a choke point that I could block quickly. For the door, I built a makeshift barricade that could swing into place. I used a shorter steel panel hinged on a piece of rail hardware as a pivot. The hinge was crude, a bolt through a drilled hole, washers scavenged from a maintenance kit, and grease from an old bearing to keep it from squealing. Squealing gets you killed underground. Every moving part had to be quiet. Inside the safe room, I created layers. One layer was physical, steel plates and bracing. One layer was light discipline, no visible light leaks. One layer was sound. Padding where I could, cloth strips wedged between metal contacts, tape over rattling edges. You learn quickly that silence is not the same as safety, but it's the closest thing you can control. Lighting was the next challenge. I kept my lights low for a reason. A bright flashlight in a tunnel can be seen from far away through cracks, through grates, through old vents. I used a headlamp with a red mode, and even that I used sparingly. Later, I found battery-powered LED work lights in an abandoned maintenance cart. They were designed for construction sites and had magnets on the back. I mounted them low, near the floor, facing inward so their light didn't spill toward the corridor entry. Air was still my biggest worry. A sealed room underground is a coffin if you don't move air. The service corridor had a faint draft, but my steel plates blocked some of it. I needed ventilation without creating a direct opening that something could crawl through. I improvised a vent system using small cracks that led toward a ventilation shaft. I found a gap behind a conduit run where the concrete had separated from an older wall section. The gap was narrow, maybe the width of 2 fingers, but it connected to a space where air moved. I tested it with a strip of plastic tape. It fluttered slightly. That was enough. I built a duct from materials you wouldn't think about. Flexible plastic sheeting, taped into a tube, reinforced with wire from a broken cable tray. It wasn't airtight, but it didn't need to be. It needed to guide air. I mounted one end near the crack and the other end inside the safe room. Then I added a small battery-powered fan, one of those compact fans people use during power outages. I had stolen it from my own apartment during the first day of panic, thinking it was pointless. It became essential. The fan didn't push much air, but it pushed enough to keep the room from feeling dead. I ran it on low, using rechargeable batteries I later scavenged. I kept it off when I needed absolute silence. Living underground changes your sense of time. There's no sunrise. There's no natural rhythm. You sleep when you can. You wake when noises change. And you measure days by how many batteries you have left. I became obsessive about mapping. The lower tunnels weren't a single corridor. They were a network. I mapped every route I could reach safely, marking safe exits and unstable zones. I didn't do it with a phone. Phones die. I did it with a notebook and a grease pencil. I drew the corridor as a line. I marked the maintenance hatch as my primary surface access. I marked the jammed inspection doorway as a secondary route. I marked every crack in the ceiling that looked like it could shed more concrete. I marked water sources, drips, seepage, pipe leaks. Some of that water was clean enough to filter. Some of it smelled like chemicals and rust, and I didn't touch it. Water was the first thing that forced me to leave my comfort zone. My 2 liters were gone within a day. You can ration food longer than water, especially underground where the air is dry and dusty. The service corridor had a steady drip that collected in a low spot where the concrete formed a shallow basin. The water looked clear. That meant nothing. Underground water can pick up contaminants from everything it touches: old oil, metal dust, biological waste, chemical residues. I needed filtration. I scavenged a small portable filter from a sports store near my apartment during the first day, the same trip when I grabbed the fan. It was designed for camping. A hollow fiber filter with a squeeze bag. It wasn't meant for industrial runoff, but it was better than raw seep water. I filtered slowly, then boiled the filtered water when I could. Boiling underground meant fire, and fire meant smoke. Smoke meant attention. I compromised by using a small fuel tablet stove inside the safe room with the fan running and a makeshift exhaust path toward the crack vent. I kept burns short and watched the air. If the room smelled like smoke for more than a minute, I stopped. I learned to heat water, not cook meals. Food came later. At first I lived on protein bars, nuts, and whatever dry food I had. Later, when I had to risk going above ground, I started raiding closed convenience stores and apartment building pantries. I avoided anything that required cooking. I carried what I could and moved back underground fast. The noises became my weather report. Water drips were constant, like a metronome. Settling concrete made occasional pops and groans, especially after heavy impacts above. The dull thudding of infected stumbling across tracks was a pattern. Sometimes it was sparse, just a few shuffles. Sometimes it was heavy, like a herd. When it was heavy, I stayed still, lights off, breathing shallow. There were other noises too, human noises. On the 9th day, based on the marks in my notebook, I heard voices above ground near my maintenance hatch, muffled through the metal, but unmistakably human. I froze with my hand on the hatch wheel from below, listening. There was urgency in the voices and then a sharp bang like someone hitting the hatch with something. The hatch didn't open. I had locked it from the inside with an improvised brace that jammed the mechanism. It wasn't a standard lock. It was a bar wedged through the handle and anchored against a pipe bracket. From above, it probably felt like rust or a jam. From below, it was deliberate. I waited. The voices moved away. A minute later, I heard infected movement, a rush of shuffling and impacts, then screaming. Not for long. I sat in the dark and held my breath until my chest hurt. That was when I stopped thinking of the tunnels as a temporary refuge. They were my home now, because above ground was chaos and I couldn't afford chaos. My safe room became a routine. Sleep in short blocks, wake and listen, check the fan, check batteries, check water, check the barricade. Every morning, if you can call it morning, I did a structural check. I inspected the beams. I looked for new dust piles that would indicate fresh falling debris. I ran my hand along the seams of the steel plates and listened for any change in the corridor's sound. Then the main escape path collapsed. It happened after what sounded like a train crash overhead, even though there were no trains. A long rumble, a series of impacts, then a deep, rolling crack that traveled along the ceiling like ripping fabric. Dust poured down the corridor, thick enough to sting my eyes. I dropped to the floor and covered my mouth with a cloth, crawling into the safe room and sealing the barricade. The rumble lasted maybe 20 seconds. It felt like a minute. When it stopped, there was silence for a beat. Then that same dull thudding again as infected moved along the debris field above like nothing had changed. I waited a full hour before I opened the barricade. When I stepped into the corridor, the air was so dusty my headlamp beam looked solid. I moved slowly toward the direction of the maintenance hatch. Halfway there, the corridor was gone. A section of ceiling had caved in completely, dumping concrete and rebar across the walkway. The passage wasn't partially blocked, it was sealed. A wall of rubble from floor to ceiling. The maintenance hatch was beyond it. My primary surface exit was cut off. I stood there staring at it, listening to the faint sound of water dripping somewhere behind the collapse. I tested the rubble with the pry bar. It shifted slightly, then settled. That was the worst sign. Settling means the structure is still moving. Digging into a fresh collapse is how you die. I backed away. I went back to my safe room, sat down, and forced myself to think like I used to think on a job site. Not emotionally. Logically. I had a secondary route, the jammed inspection doorway, the forgotten utility chamber beyond it. I had avoided it because I didn't need it. Now I needed it. Opening that door became the most important thing in my life. The door was old steel with a heavy frame, partially buried behind conduit racks and layers of grime. The handle was stiff. The hinges were crusted with rust. I sprayed them with lubricant I found in a maintenance cart, penetrating oil, the kind that smells sharp and chemical. I worked it into the hinge pins and waited. Then I worked the handle again. Nothing. I took the pry bar and applied pressure at the door seam. Slow, steady pressure, listening for creaks. The door flexed slightly, then stopped. The frame held it. I found the reason after 10 minutes of careful prying. Mineral deposits had formed along the bottom edge, like the door had been sitting in a shallow flood at some point. The deposits had hardened like concrete. The door wasn't locked, it was glued shut by time. I chipped at the deposits with the edge of the pry bar and a piece of rail spike like a chisel. I did it slowly to avoid loud impacts. Dust and white powder flaked off. After an hour, I had cleared enough to try again. The handle moved a fraction. I didn't celebrate underground. Celebrating is how you lose focus. I kept working. The door gave me a little more each time. At some point, the hinge finally shifted with a squeal I hadn't expected. I froze, heart pounding. Then quickly shoved a strip of cloth into the hinge gap to muffle any future movement. I worked more oil into it. I did everything I could to keep that hinge quiet. Finally, after what felt like half a day, the door cracked open. The air that came out was colder and smelled different. Less dust, more damp stone. I widened the gap and shone my headlamp through. Beyond the door was a utility chamber. It wasn't a big room. It was a narrow space with concrete walls and a low ceiling. Pipes ran along one side, insulated in places, bare in others. There was a metal ladder bolted into the wall leading upward to another hatch, this one smaller and more modern. There were also junction boxes, conduit runs, and a grated floor drain in the center that fed into a lower channel. It looked like the kind of place that exists everywhere under the city, but nobody talks about. It also looked like a second chance. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, not fully, just enough to keep it from swinging. I listened. The chamber was quieter than the service corridor. No thuds overhead, just water and the faint hum of distant ventilation. My first instinct was to explore upward. That ladder likely led to street level or a building basement, but it didn't climb yet. I needed to make this chamber usable as part of my network, not just a desperate escape. I mapped it. I marked the door location, the ladder, the drain, and the pipe routes. The pipes told a story. Some were water supply, some were storm drains, some were electrical conduit. I couldn't trace them far, but I could identify their function by size, insulation, and markings. One pipe had an old tag plate with faded numbers. I wrote them down anyway. In a system like this, numbers can lead to maps, and maps can lead to exits. Back in my safe room, I revised my plan. If my main escape path was blocked, my safe room needed to be capable of holding out longer without surface trips. That meant better water collection and better power management. Power underground is never about having electricity. It's about having enough to stay invisible. I scavenged more batteries from abandoned devices. I found a charging station in a maintenance locker, one of those multi-bay chargers used for radios and tools. It was useless without grid power, but the charger came with spare battery packs, and those packs could be cannibalized. I also found a portable power bank. Large capacity, heavy, meant for camping and emergency use. It held a charge for a while. I guarded it like it was food. I expanded my water collection by setting up a catch basin under a steady drip. I made the basin from a cut plastic container and lined it with a clean cloth to catch sediment. I filtered everything. I never drank without filtering. When I could, I boiled small amounts. The tunnel became my geography. I learned how far I could move without exhausting myself. I learned where the air got thicker and where it got fresher. I learned where the infected tended to cluster, based on sound patterns and the occasional glimpses I risked through grates and cracks. They wandered along track beds, bumped into walls, turned back, repeated. Sometimes they fell onto lower service walkways and thrashed until they found a way out or got stuck. Those stuck ones were the worst because they didn't go away. They stayed in one spot, bumping and scraping, a constant hazard if you had to pass near them. I avoided killing them unless I had no choice. Quiet kills are not simple, and loud kills are invitations. I did have a knife and a pry bar, but I wasn't interested in wrestling anything in a narrow corridor. My strategy was avoidance and sealing. It worked for a while. Then I heard running. Not shuffling, not stumbling, running. Footsteps, fast and panicked, coming down the tunnel line above my service corridor. The sound echoed through the concrete and I could hear voices, human voices, close and desperate. Then the infected came with them. You don't have to see it to understand what's happening. Infected don't plan. They respond. They chase noise and movement. A group of survivors running in the tunnels is like dragging a chain of alarms behind you. The footsteps grew louder, then turned, then came closer to my corridor section. I killed my lights instantly and moved into the safe room, sealing the barricade without making it click. I crouched behind the steel plate door, pistol in hand, muzzle pointed down, finger off the trigger. I listened. Voices in the corridor, not far from my entrance gap. Someone coughing, someone sobbing. A man whispering, harsh and urgent. Then a metallic bang, someone hitting something, maybe a locked gate, maybe a door. A woman spoke, low but sharp. This way. Here. I see a hatch. My stomach tightened. The maintenance hatch, the one I'd used. The one now blocked by collapse on my side, but maybe still visible from theirs. Then came the other sound. Infected impacts, closer now, like a storm hitting a door. The survivors had brought them right to the choke points. A child cried out. A short burst of panic, immediately silenced by a hand, and then someone said, "Please, please, just open." They weren't talking to me yet. They were talking to the hatch, to any door, to anything that might give. A loud crash echoed through the corridor as something slammed into a metal surface. The infected were right behind them. I could have stayed silent. That's what living underground teaches you. Silence is safety. If I stay silent, they might not find my corridor, might not notice the seam where my steel plates were, might not discover the narrow entry I'd built. But if they died out there, the infected would keep moving. They would spread into every side path, every service space. They might end up pressing against my barricade for hours, days, until something gave. And I could hear the difference in the voices. These weren't looters hunting for supplies. They were fleeing, tired, scared, not thinking beyond the next door. A second crash, closer, the sound of a body hitting concrete. A man shouted, "Move, move!" Then the worst sound. The scraping. Fast now, almost coordinated only because so many bodies were moving at once. The infected were in the corridor. I took a breath, forced myself to make a decision, and did the one thing that went against every instinct I'd built underground. I intervened. I didn't swing my barricade open. I didn't step into the corridor. I did something smarter and still risky. I used my environment. Along the corridor outside my safe room, there was an old maintenance cabinet mounted to the wall. Empty now, door hanging open. I had wedged debris behind it weeks ago to make it less obvious. That cabinet backed onto a narrow gap behind a conduit run, and that gap connected to the utility chamber route. It wasn't meant for people, but it was big enough for a small adult if they were willing to crawl. I cracked my barricade just enough to whisper into the corridor. "Down. Lights off," I said, low and firm, not yelling, not panicking. "If you can hear me, crawl. Follow my voice." Silence for a split second, then a whisper back, shocked. "Who is that?" "Quiet," I said. "No lights, no talking. Crawl to the cabinet on the wall. Move now." I heard them shift, fabric scraping concrete, a suppressed cough, then a muffled voice, female, close. "Cabinet, I see it." The infected slammed into something farther down the corridor, like they'd hit a barrier or stumbled over debris. The survivors were between my safe room and the infected. That was bad for them and dangerous for me. I used the pry bar from inside to tap a rhythm on the steel plate. Soft, controlled, a guide signal. Tap, tap, pause, tap, not loud. Just enough. I heard hands on metal. The cabinet door rattled and I winced. I reached through my entry gap and steadied it, holding it so it wouldn't clang. A face appeared in the darkness, pale, eyes wide. A woman, late 30s maybe, dirt streaked across her cheek. She had a headlamp on her forehead, but it was off. "Good," she whispered, "please." Behind her I saw two more shapes, one man, one smaller figure that could only be a kid. "In," I whispered, one at a time, no light. They didn't ask questions. They crawled. The gap behind the cabinet was brutal. It was cramped, lined with the dust and old cable bundles, and it required them to flatten themselves. The kid started to panic, breathing fast. The man put a hand on the kid's back and guided them, whispering something I couldn't hear. The infected were closer now. I could hear their feet scuffing, their hands scraping along walls. One of them hit the cabinet hard enough that the metal vibrated against my fingers. I held it steady. The woman made it through first, then the kid, then the man. As soon as the last one cleared the gap, I shoved the cabinet door back into place and wedged it with a chunk of concrete I'd kept ready. The cabinet looked like a dead end again. Then I sealed my barricade fully and moved them into my safe room through the narrow entry, one by one, squeezing past the steel plate. Inside, they crouched in the dim red light of my headlamp, breathing hard, trying not to make noise. The safe room wasn't comfortable for one person. For four, it felt like a cramped locker. The woman raised her hand slightly, palms out, the universal sign of, "I'm not a threat." "I'm Nadia," she whispered. "Nadia Volkov. Nurse. Bellevue. We're not." She stopped herself, listening as the infected thudded outside. The man spoke next, quiet and controlled, in a way that told me he'd been forcing calm for someone else. "Marcus Hill. I'm a paramedic. This is my nephew, Eli." The kid, Eli, looked about 8 or 9, maybe 10, face smudged with soot, eyes too alert for his age. He clutched a small backpack tight, like it was the last thing he owned. I nodded once. "Stay low, no sound." We listened together. Outside, infected moved past the cabinet. One of them lingered, scraping at the wall. Another slammed into the rubble pile. The sounds circled, then drifted away, pulled by echoes deeper in the tunnel. Minutes passed. It felt like hours. When the corridor finally quieted, I let my shoulders drop a fraction. Nadia looked around the safe room, eyes scanning the steel plates, the bracing, the fan duct. She didn't look impressed. She looked relieved. "How long have you been down here?" she whispered. "Long enough," I said. "You brought trouble." Her face tightened, guilt flashing. "We didn't mean to. We got pushed into the tunnels. Above ground was..." It was worse. Marcus swallowed, his throat working. "We had a group. It broke apart. Someone opened a door they shouldn't have. We ran." Eli's hands were shaking slightly. He tried to hide it. I didn't want their story yet. I wanted to solve the immediate problem. 4 people in a room meant 4 people breathing. My fan was small, my duct was improvised. The air was going to go bad if we stayed sealed too long. I pointed toward the vent duct and the fan. "That's air, it's not a lot. No talking unless you have to." Nadia nodded quickly, professional instincts overriding fear. She reached into her own bag and pulled out something that made my heart jump, a compact trauma kit, real supplies, not a convenience store first aid pouch. Tourniquets, gauze, tape, antiseptic. She'd taken it from a hospital or an ambulance. That meant she'd thought ahead. Marcus noticed my glance and whispered, "We have a little food and water. Not enough." I didn't answer immediately. Underground trust is expensive, but so is turning people away after you've already pulled them in. I needed to know if they could be useful, not as soldiers, as teammates. "What brought you into my corridor?" I asked. Marcus hesitated, then answered honestly. "We heard this station had a service path to a street hatch. We were trying to get to the river. Someone said there were boats." "Someone said," I repeated quietly, and he flinched. "In this world, rumors killed people." Nadia leaned closer, voice barely audible. "We can't go back up, not right now. Please, just let us rest for a little while." Eli's eyes met mine, pleading without words. I made a decision I didn't want to make. "You rest," I said, "but we need rules." They waited. "No lights unless I say, no noise, no opening doors. If you panic, you get us all killed," I said, keeping my voice flat. "If you steal from me, you won't get a second chance." Marcus nodded immediately. Nadia nodded too, jaw tight. I looked at Eli. "You understand?" He nodded, quick and eager. I sat back against the steel plate, pistol still in my lap, and tried to think ahead. Because bringing 3 strangers into my safe room wasn't the problem. The problem was what they dragged behind them. and what the tunnels would become now that more humans were moving through them. That night, if you can call it night, I learned something I hadn't planned for. They weren't the only survivors using the subway. Hours after they arrived, we heard a different kind of sound in the tunnel. Metal scraping metal, controlled, deliberate, not infected. People moving something heavy. Marcus's eyes widened. Nadia's hand went to her mouth. I killed the fan for a moment and listened, counting the seconds between sounds, trying to locate direction. The scraping came from farther down the corridor, past the collapse zone I could no longer reach, possibly from a parallel service path. Then came a voice, low and firm, echoing faintly through the concrete. "Clear the line. Keep it tight. No talking." A group, organized, not panicked. Nadia mouthed silently, "More people." Marcus whispered, barely audible, "That's not good." He was right. More people meant more noise, more chance of infected tracking, more chance of conflict. And underground, conflict isn't a fight in an open space, it's a trap, it's a bottleneck, it's someone blocking the only exit. I checked my map, the grease pencil lines and notes that had become my world. The corridor routes, the utility chamber, the ladder hatch that might lead up to a different surface exit. The old inspection doorway I'd finally opened. For the first time since I built the safe room, I realized I might have to abandon it. Not because it failed, because it succeeded, and success attracts attention. The scraping grew closer. I looked at Nadia, Marcus, and Eli, all watching me in the dim red light, waiting for me to decide what kind of person I was going to be in a world that no longer rewarded kindness. I pointed toward the inspection doorway route and whispered the only plan that made sense. "We move," I said. "Quiet, now, utility chamber, no debate." Marcus's face tightened. "Where does it go?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but it goes somewhere that isn't here." Nadia nodded once, already shifting her bag onto her shoulders. Eli swallowed hard and mimicked the adults, trying to be brave. I opened the barricade slowly, listening for any sudden change in sound. The corridor was still quiet where we were, but the human group was close enough now that I could hear their breathing and the soft clink of gear. We slipped out, one by one, moving like shadows, staying low, headlamps off, guided by memory and touch. I led them to the cabinet gap and pushed it open just enough to let us slide through into the narrow conduit space. The gap scraped our shoulders and tore fabric. Eli whimpered once, then clamped his mouth shut, eyes wide with effort. We reached the inspection doorway and eased it open, hinge muffled by the cloth I'd jammed earlier. The utility chamber welcomed us with its damp, colder air. I closed the door behind us, not locking it, just sealing it as well as I could with a wedge. For a moment, in that chamber, we were suspended in silence. Then the sound of the other group reached us through the wall, voices now closer, more distinct. "One of these corridors leads to a chamber," someone said. "Check for air, check for light leaks." They were searching. They weren't just passing through, they were hunting for spaces like mine. I looked up at the ladder leading to the smaller hatch above. This was the next decision point. Go up into the city again, or go deeper into whatever the lower system connected to. I put my hand on the ladder rung. It was cold and damp. And above us, somewhere beyond concrete and steel, the city was still alive in the worst way. I turned back to Nadia and Marcus, and I spoke in the same flat, practical tone I used on job sites when something was about to go wrong. "Listen," I said. "If we go up fast, we don't linger, and we don't run unless we have to. Running brings them." Marcus nodded. Nadia nodded. Eli nodded, jaw clenched. I started climbing. The rungs were slick. I climbed slowly, keeping 3 points of contact, careful not to bang my boots against the ladder. At the top, the hatch was smaller than the maintenance plate I'd used before. It had a wheel handle and a rubber seal. That meant it was designed to keep water out. Or keep something in. I put my ear against it and listened. Nothing. I turned the wheel slowly. The hatch resisted at first, then gave with a soft pop as the seal broke. Cold air washed down the shaft. Real cold, winter air, the kind that makes your lungs expand. It smelled like exhaust and wet pavement. I cracked the hatch just a fraction and looked through. Dim light, a concrete space above, not a street. A basement, maybe a service room under a building. I could see pipes and a metal shelving unit, no movement, no infected. I opened it wider and slid through, rolling to the side and keeping my body low. I was in a building's utility basement. I didn't know which building yet, but I knew what it meant. We had found a new kind of exit. Not a subway station entrance, not a street grate, a building connection. That was the advantage of going underground. The system touches everything. I leaned back down the hatch and whispered, "Clear. Basement. Come up." Nadia came first, then Marcus, then Eli. We moved as a unit, staying tight, scanning corners, listening for any sound above us. The basement smelled stale, but not dangerous. There were water heaters, electrical panels, and a locked cage that likely held tools. Marcus looked at the electrical panels with the same instinct I had. Power, doors, alarms. Nadia scanned for medical supplies, habit turning her head. Eli stared at the stairs leading up, eyes wide as if expecting something to come down at any second. I went to the basement door and tested it. Locked, of course. But it was a standard commercial lock, not a vault. I had a pry bar. I stopped myself. Prying a door is loud. I looked around for another option, a keypad, a push bar, anything that let us leave without advertising. Then I heard it. Above us, muffled through the ceiling, a thud. Then another. Then a dragging sound. Not the subway anymore. Something was in the building. I met Marcus's eyes. He understood immediately. We had escaped one problem and climbed into another. And behind us, in the tunnels, there was an organized group searching for hidden rooms. That was the moment I realized the safe room wasn't just a shelter. It was a prize. And prizes get contested. I tightened my grip on the pry bar, kept my voice low, and made a promise to myself that I would hold on to for the rest of the days that followed. I would not die underground because I refused to adapt. I would not die above ground because I rushed. And if I had to build another safe room, I would build it in a place nobody else wanted. Because in this city, in this outbreak, survival wasn't about strength. It was about choosing the right invisible spaces and knowing when to abandon them before the world found you. We stood in that basement, 4 people who had never met a week ago, listening to something move upstairs, while the tunnel system we trusted started to fill with strangers. And I knew the next 24 hours would decide whether my underground life was about to become a shared refuge, or a battlefield I couldn't win. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.